Okay, the session is now recommencing. We're reconvening the UN Decade session at the Sarah Conference 2021. I'd like to introduce our next speaker, who is Tim Cronin, Senior Manager, Landscape Restoration and Protection from WWF Australia. Tim is going to be talking about integrated approaches for habitat restoration and protection from global to local, and he'll be referring to the UN Decade and the challenges of those for not-for-profit organisations. Tim, have we got you online?
You do. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. We haven't got the visuals yet. Have you got your camera on?
I do. I'm just going to share my...
Excellent.
Can you see those slides?
Yeah, we've even got your slide. You can screen share. You can full screen start your slideshow.
Great. Fantastic.
Great.
Thank you very much, team. And my apologies, I can't be there in Darwin. I wish I was, but I'm here on Gadigal country in Sydney, and I'd also like to pay my respects to the traditional owners of the country and particularly the leaders past, present and emerging. I will do my best to stick to time, preferably 15 minutes. So team, please do ring the bell.
I'll ring a bell at 2 minutes to the end of the 15 minutes, okay?
Yep, sounds good. Thank you. So I want to talk a bit about integrated approaches for habitat restoration and protection. A lot of speakers have already touched on the fact that, you know, we really don't want to look at restoration in isolation. And I also want to talk a little bit about some global perspectives and examples we have from WWF. I'll talk briefly about some of the broad kind of strategic approaches we take to this work. And I'll look at a couple of examples. One in central Kalimantan in Indonesia that WWF Australia has been supporting for a number of years. We're 15 to 20 years into the journey of landscape restoration there. So there's a lot of outcomes and a lot of lessons to point to there. The second example I'll point to is the bushfire zone of Southeast Australia, which is, you know, very much at the starting blocks of what we expect will be a, you know, similarly long-term, you know, commitment and restoration effort. So look, strategically, you know, and echoing some of the things that James from TNC pointed to earlier, WWF is a global conservation organisation. We have some bold goals. What I'm presenting here is what we call a new deal for nature and people, and it's some of the global targets that we think, you know, need to be committed to, and they really form our input and our advocacy into the UNCBD, the UNFCCC, and the Sustainable Development Goals. We think in the next decade, we need to achieve what we call 0-0-1/2, zero loss of natural habitats, zero extinction of species, and we need to halve our footprint of production and consumption. When we go about designing programs to try and achieve those kinds of outcomes, I tend to draw on this framework, what we refer to as a one planet framework, something that WWF put together some years ago, and it still resonates with me. It can be applied at a number of scales, landscape scale, national scale. And essentially what it says is, you know, we need a whole suite of integrated approaches, many of which have been touched on today, if we want to achieve sustainable land management at scale and into the long term. You know, not only do we need to protect and restore on the ground, we need to address production and consumption patterns. We need to redirect financial flows, and, you know, we need to really look at equitable resource governance. And, you know, that last point around resource governance, I think, is a really, you know, key recurring theme, particularly across the tropics. I'll talk a little bit about that in Indonesia, but, you know, often here in Australia, as a, you know, fully industrialized and very wealthy country, we think we're immune to many of the governance challenges that we see, you know, across the tropics that are driving deforestation and degradation. I don't think that's the case by any means. In terms of where we focus our efforts, we tend to look primarily at what we refer to as deforestation fronts. So where are those areas across the world that are undergoing the greatest rates of deforestation and degradation? This map here is from a report released very early this year. 24 deforestation fronts, 23 of which are in the tropics. Just one isn't. Just one is a developed country. and that is Australia. Eastern Australia continues to lose forests at an alarming rate. I think it was Ian very early on in this session pointed to in the order of 1.2 million hectares of forest cleared in Queensland alone over a 3 or 4 year period earlier this decade or last decade. So some major issues, we're looking at here that we need to tackle, even before we need to look at restoration. The other area, as I said, I'll focus on is Indonesia, particularly Indonesian Borneo, somewhere that people often think about when we think about deforestation and degradation, but this is a pretty stark reminder that we've got some pretty serious issues in our own backyard as well. Looking at restoration more specifically, as opposed to deforestation, this chart here actually came from a report that was released yesterday. Some people might have seen in the news this morning talk, of this report under the Trillion Trees program, which is a major international effort focused primarily on restoration, but also protection, being led by WCS, WWF and BirdLife. This particular report points to 59 million hectares that have naturally regenerated since 2000, I think it was, so over a 17-year period, equating to 22 billion trees, 5.9 gigatons, of carbon sequestered, across those forested areas. So massive opportunities for restoration and natural regeneration across the globe. Huge effort in that space, but again, when we look at those numbers, as encouraging as 59 million hectares is, the Sydney Morning Herald article that spoke of this report this morning also pointed to 380 odd million hectares of forest having been cleared over the last 20 years. So I think it's again, you've got to look at it in that light, and there's no point putting a hell of a lot of resources into planting trees or undergoing resource intensive restoration efforts if we're continuing to knock down forests at 5, 6, 7 or 10 times the rate. So what are a couple of examples of what we're doing in WWF to try and address these things? As I said, Indonesia is a major focus, Indonesian Borneo in particular. It's an area that's suffered major loss of forests. About 50% of forest cover on the island of Borneo has been lost in about the last 50 years. What you're looking at here, the light shade of green is forest cover, the dark shade of green is protected areas. So there's a reasonable protected area estate across the island, but most of it is in the Central Highlands area, quite inaccessible, much of it unproductive. If you look at the highly productive and highly populated areas in the lowland coastal areas, there's not a lot of forest left there. One area that we've been working intensively for quite some time that I've highlighted here is regarded as the Sabangau, we call the Sabangau-Kattingen landscape, to the bottom southeast of that oval is a protected area, Sabangau National Park. To the northwest of that red circle is another protected area, Bukit Baka, Bukit Raya, and in between is a really heavily productive landscape that we're seeking to protect using a number of mechanisms. But first I want to talk a little bit about the national park within Sabangau. So in this map here, that's the purple area. Not surprisingly, as WWF, when we work on landscapes, when we work on most issues to do with conservation, we talk about species. More often than not, we talk about charismatic megafauna such as the orangutan. Tends to get people's interest, it tends to bring in dollars, but more often than not, when we look at the solutions we actually have to carry out in these areas, it gets back to land use governance, it gets back to sustainable livelihood opportunities, it gets back to market failures, it gets back to demand signals for commodity production and financial flows. So if you look at this purple area, Sabangau National Park, it was heavily degraded through the peak of Indonesia's illegal logging era throughout the 80s and 90s, to the point where it was almost a wasteland at the turn of the century. At that point, it was still a major habitat for orangutans, but those populations were declining rapidly. So initially, WWF put in a major advocacy effort to have that area designated as a national park, and I think it was 17 different timber mills in and around that landscape were shut down. So that didn't necessarily go down particularly well with a lot of people. So they've been, fighting battles for many, many years. But we've had huge positive outcomes to the point now. 15 years later, there's huge buy-in both socially as well as environmentally, and economic outcomes as well as environmental ones. The effort that's gone in since that area was declared a national park has been a massive effort of restoration at scale. It's a peatland forest. And what happens in peatland forests in Indonesia, particularly in the lowland areas, over the 80s and 90s, was they were cleared initially for illegal logging, and they were drained, So that means a lot of canals were dug in these areas. The water was drained. That enabled the local communities to get access to clear the trees, and in some cases to plant crops. In most cases, oil palm. What that's done is it's dried out the landscape massively, and that's been a major contributor to the huge peat and forest fires that we see on an almost annual basis in Indonesia. That came to a head in 2015, where I think it was the worst, peat fire season or forest fire season there they've seen in years, and the haze across Singapore, across Malaysia and the rest of Southeast Asia really forced a huge amount of attention and political will when it comes to peatland restoration and landscape restoration more broadly. But this effort in Sabang has, very much predated that. So ever since it was declared a national park back in 2004, WWF's been working with, the National Park Authority and local communities to re-wet the wetland ecosystem, primarily through damming those canals. What we've done there, I think it is, I'd have to check my notes, but 2,000 dams have been built to block the canals, and 300,000 hectares of a 600,000 hectare landscape has been re-wet. Only very small amounts have been revegetated, and you can see that in the map on the right, the red grid areas, and that's where areas have been so severely depleted and degraded through fire and clearing that there's been no seed bank. But generally speaking, it's been a case of relatively, well, I say small scale. Building 2,000 dams is not a small scale effort, but, compared to, revegetating 600,000 hectare, building 2,000 dams, many of them quite small, in a very targeted and strategic sense to re-wet that landscape at that scale, I think is a really good illustration of how we can actually have quite significant impact at landscape scale through very targeted site-specific actions. You can see here some visuals from 2005. As I said, it's something of a wasteland post legal logging and clearing, and what you see here is a decade later, and it's almost exact photo points there. So quite transformational over a decade. What we're focusing on now, we certainly haven't, down tools in the park, but, you can see there's been a massive effort. It's about kind of shoring up those outcomes. And a lot of the efforts, in and around Sabang National Park has been with local communities and making sure that there is that social buy-in, and that there isn't that drive to, re-clear, re-drain, and crop some of those areas. But outside the park is where the greatest threats are at the moment. You can see in this map here, this corridor here, we call the Katingan corridor between these two protected areas, which is a really important corridor for orangutans. Will be increasingly important in the future to avoid that genetic isolation. What we see with the colour coding here is in the light yellow is basically allocated to production forestry, and in the red is for conversion. And in most cases there, that equates to oil palm. So what you can see, massive threats within that landscape, and a lot of work needed to be done, particularly with the production forestry operators, to make sure that their operations can be compatible with habitat connectivity and species distribution, which is not out of the question. There are some good examples in forest management in Indonesia. They are few and far between, but they're getting better. where we do have selectively logged operations in these tropical forest areas, very high value timber. And I've been to some forest areas there that are very profitable, but remove as few as 5 or 6 trees per hectare. So it can be done, but we're pretty early stages of that effort. And a lot of that is really focused on establishing a multi-stakeholder kind of roundtable approach, bringing together the major forestry operators, the major oil palm operators, local, district, provincial governments, to look at that at landscape scale and come up and agree a spatial plan that retains as much habitat connectivity as possible across that corridor area, while also allowing for, you know, productive landscapes, income, revenues into the future. So we'll keep you posted on that one. We're reasonably hopeful, but if you look at, you know, how that corridor is shaping up, it's pretty intact at the moment, but getting, you know, pretty thin in parts. So we've got a battle on our hands and a lot of urgency in order to make that happen. But I think the experience within the park in Sabangau shows that there's quite a bit of, you know, goodwill across that landscape that we've built.
Thank you so much. That's a really good case study, Tim. And
am I done already?
Your time's well and truly up, and there's no time for questions, unfortunately. But
Oh, well.
we can definitely draw extrapolate from that to our own circumstances here in Australasia, and particularly Australia, where we need to be thinking globally as well as acting locally. So you've provided a very good case study there, Tim. So thanks so much.
No worries. Thanks, team.